Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the City of Glen Ira's Seniors Festival. Today, we're doing a webinar on thrifty gardening. My name is Maria Ciavarella, and I am going to be talking to you today for about 3/4 of an hour, and then I'll be taking time for your chat and your questions. I don't know where you are, but outside the sun is shining, and finally it looks like a really, really nice afternoon for gardening. But before you rush out, there's lots of things I'm going to teach you. But before we start, and most importantly, the City of Glen Ira acknowledges the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which Glen Ira resides. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. This is the land that we look after in our own gardens as well. And so we're almost like custodians for the next generation that take after it. And gardeners really do understand how important it is to look after the land on which we're looking after. But how do you look after it really well without spending a fortune? And that's what I'm here about today. So you might get really confused. Remember the days we were allowed to go into shops and browse? Well, you could be confronted with aisle upon aisle of gardening tools, implements, fertilizers, weedicides, herbicides, and so on. And it's hard to know whether you're being sold something that's genuinely good or something that is just like anything else, but in different packaging. So you can spend a lot of money on gardening without really needing to. So don't get me wrong, I love spending money on my garden, but only if it's necessary. And over the years, because I've been gardening for a long time, I do realise that there are ways and shortcuts, things that you can do quite simply at very little cost to save you money rushing out to garden centres when we're allowed to do so. So it's a little bit of what I call nanotechnology. Do like your nana might have done. Your grandma, your grandpa. Back in the day when the shops weren't laden with all these lovely things that would entice us to buy them, they managed to make do and have wonderful gardens to boot. So I call it the triple S principle. So we're looking at scrounging around for items that we can possibly use. And then saving. Before you throw anything out, you ask yourself, I wonder if I could use this in the garden. And the top left corner photo we've got there, you probably recognise there's some seeds growing, but what are they growing in? Yep, they are toilet rolls. Make fantastic little seed raising pots. So they're really good. And then sharing as well. So you as a gardener, gardeners are incredibly generous people. They really are. In fact, I sort of pride myself on being that as well. Tomorrow when I go to work, I'm going to be taking excess seedlings, tomato seedlings that I don't need in my own garden. So gardeners do love to share. So you share amongst yourselves and other gardeners as well. So what we're looking at today is how to make gold in your garden. More on that in a sec. A bit about potting mixes, because here is where a lot of money is spent and sometimes wasted too. Do-it-yourself fertilizers. It's probably not what you're thinking. There's other ways of doing things too. How to get new plants out of old ones. And how to upcycle. Now, upcycle is the term of the moment, having a look at that milk carton, for example, a plastic milk bottle. Can we, after the milk's been drunk, of course, can we use that for something else and not for its original purpose? And that's what upcycling is all about. So I'd invite you as well in the chat function that there is on YouTube there, if you have any great ideas of where you've been saving money in your garden, or if you've got questions about gardening in general or any of the topics that I'm going to present, please do. You'll find lots of the tips and ideas that I've got on my website. I run a website or a small business called My Green Garden, and I'll leave the link at the end. So my first tip, if you're not doing it already, is to make compost. you can save a lot of dollars in your garden by making compost. It is the gardener's, honestly, your garden's best friend. Of course, the environment as well. Now, I'm pretty sure Glen Ira now has a green waste bin where they take your kitchen scraps. I'm in the city of Manningham. We don't have that yet. And even if we did, I still wouldn't be putting my kitchen scraps out for rubbish collection. I'd be keeping it on site so I can make some wonderful compost. So what do I use it for? First of all, it adds microbial life to your soil. A big deal, you might say. Why do I need microbes in my soil? Well, look, you might be understanding now, we are understanding a lot more about, for example, our own human gut health and how there are beneficial microbes that really keep all the baddies at bay, and how a good gut microbial life in your gut is really important. It's the same for your soil. And compost or any rotten organic matter will add microbial life to your soil. So your soil becomes a living organism, not just dirt. So it invigorates your garden soil. I also use compost if I've got potting mix, and we'll talk about this a little bit further on. I'll use compost to bulk out potting mix. So cheap potting mix is just that. It's really just broken down pine bark. Not much in terms of nutrient value. Your compost will help, and I'll go up to 50-50 with the potting mix just to make it a lot better. But I will talk a little bit about potting mix a bit more. Old potting mix, if you've got a large pot or planter and you've emptied it out wanting to put in some new plants, what do you do with that old potting mix? Can you still reuse it? Well, you might not be able to reuse it as it is, but by adding compost to it, it certainly gives it a second life all over again. You could make it into a fertiliser, and that's just steeping it into a bag and putting it in a large bucket, and all that lovely leachate will come through. So when it comes to compost, my dollar-saving tip is keep making it. Make more than you think you'll need. I've been making compost for years, and so now when I go and sort of, tickle around in the soil, it's just teeming with, say, earthworms, and they're the sort of beneficial things I can see. There are also microbe life that I can't see, but I know is there. The longer you age your compost, the better it is. So you might be asking, well, how do you make compost? I'm just going to give you a quick overview of that. It does help in suburban gardens to actually have a compost container, something to put your compost, your kitchen scraps as well as everything else in. There are expensive ones and there are the cheap ones. So I actually do prefer the cheap ones. I make fantastic compost in those standalone bins that just stand directly onto garden soil. How to get them cheaply? Go online. Now, if you're online on Facebook, go to Marketplace or go to eBay or any of those other online market sharing things. A lot of people start making compost. It doesn't work for them, so they want to get rid of this thing out of their garden. So you can pick them up really cheaply. That one on the right, in fact, I picked up for nothing. It was in someone's hard waste collection, so I wasn't going to let that one go. And I've got it at home, and now I've got 4 compost bins that I'm actively using. So what composting is, of course, it's your uncooked kitchen scraps, and there's eggshells in there, and there's orange peel and so on. Don't let people tell you can't put them in. You can, but if you just use kitchen scraps in your compost, it's not going to be very good. It's just going to result in a decaying, slimy mess. So we need to add other things. So if you've got a garden, I'm presuming you have, you might have garden prunings. Cut them up into smaller pieces, add them to your compost as well. But even if you don't have that, you might be able to have access to things like autumn leaves. Now's not the right time of the year, but in autumn, certainly, there's going to be a lot of these around, and in leafy Glen Ira, I'm sure there will be. So what I do is I do go around and scoop them up, certainly from my own garden, but where there are large trees and they're dropping all their leaves in parks, I'll go out there. I do have a high-vis vest just to make it look a bit more official so people don't think I'm completely crazy, and I'll pick up some of this dried organic matter. But look, even if you can't get to parks, can't do that sort of thing, you probably have dried organic matter lurking around in your house anyway. And it could be things like there's that toilet roll again. So cardboard items, keep those, chuck them in your compost. Egg cartons, particularly the base of the egg cartons rather than the lid, because the lid has shiny, glossy paper on it. I don't like to put that in the compost, but certainly a base. Tear up all of those, put those in the compost. And then we have a lovely balance of not just your kitchen scraps, but other things as well. And lastly, in this compost equation, we need to turn the contents regularly. Now, that doesn't mean taking everything apart and turning it all over and moving from one bin to the other. It just means getting in there with a large garden fork, or there's special compost turners, not strictly necessary, but this large garden fork, and just mixing things up, because this adds another component of that equation, the air that's needed for composting. So putting all those things together and we get this lovely broken down organic matter, which will save you a lot of money in the garden for lots and lots of reasons. Now, again, this has just been a very brief overview of composting. My website at My Green Garden has lots of how-to videos on how to make compost fast, how to make compost slow, and so on, just to make it a lot easier, but it's my friend in the garden. Okay, now, you might not have space for a large garden, so you might be constrained to growing in pots. Now, when it comes to pots, size does matter. And those two pots on the left, the one that looks like terracotta but it's actually plastic, and the black plastic, they are roughly the same size. And the width across the top is about 35 centimetres. I think 38 last time I measured. And then progressively getting smaller. Now, if you're going to grow vegetables, and fruit and veggies are my specialty, I do grow ornamental plants, but they have to look after themselves, basically the ornamentals, because I grow food to eat it. So if you want to grow food, you really do need to go for larger pots. The smaller ones, like the one right at the very end down here, that's, what could you grow in that? Perhaps some basil, and I just mean a little bit of basil. Plants need, if you want productive plants, plants that are going to feed you, they need as much root run or space to spread their roots as possible. That way they can grab as much nutrient as they can. In the garden, those roots will travel to get to the nutrients, but in pots, they're constrained. I know plastic doesn't look as attractive, but the plants actually do better in plastic pots. So you may be able to pick up some of these, and you might have an ornamental terracotta pot or an ornamental glazed pot. I wouldn't be planting straight into it. I'd be planting into one of these plastic ones and then sitting it into your ornamental pot. Black plastic on its own, when it's exposed to extreme heat, is going to dry out your soil very quickly. So I would never use black plastic exposed as such, but set it inside something that's a bit more ornamental. So larger pots are better at retaining water too. You won't need to water them as often. Now, I mean, springtime's been very wet, and apparently we're heading for a wet summer as well, but usually pots do tend to dry out if you don't water them daily or even twice a day. And once pots have dried out, what happens is the soil medium that's in there becomes what's called hydrophobic, and it's very difficult to re-wet. So the important thing is not to let them dry out in the first place. If you're going to use old pots, they do need to be sterilised, and that simply means give them a good wash just to get rid of any existing soil on there, because that might harbour detrimental or bacteria that's not good for your growth. And then I would give them a quick squirt with a diluted bleach solution. Just a quick squirt, just to get rid of anything that might still be lurking there. So just be careful of that. Now, if you need pots, ask a gardener and have a think for yourself. Have you got a sort of part of your shed or something that's harbouring old pots? Some nurseries used to be able to take them for recycling. They don't necessarily go out into your recycling bins. It depends on each council, so I'm not sure about yours. So gardeners will often have piles of them just sitting there waiting to be reused or gifted away to people, particularly large pots. are very, very good. The smaller ones I would probably use for propagating rather than growing things long term. So other pots, definitely if you're limited for space, you could also look at things like this. Now this is a polystyrene fruit and veg box that your greengrocer will have. It already contains a lot of drainage for you, so you don't need to be poking holes into it. They don't come painted up, but if you've got any old house paint around the place, paint them up. Just make them look a little bit more attractive rather than just a white polystyrene. And there was growing, 4 or 5, in fact 6 broccoli plants. The broccoli will do well if you've got a good position. Now, I've got a large garden, but I am limited for space in wintertime simply because it's a large shady garden, and in winter I have even more shade than usual. So that's why I do grow in pots in wintertime, so I can move them to the sunniest parts of the house. So go to your greengrocer, ask for a fruit box. Here's another good option for a pot if you've got a little bit larger space, but good for shallow rooted plants. They are those clam shells, those large, they're sold as, I suppose, sand pits or little wading pools for toddlers. People grow out of, the kids grow out of them, people get rid of them, so hard waste will often have those. Now they're only good for shallow rooted plants. So I wouldn't be planting tomatoes in them, for example, because bigger, taller plants need a deeper root run, and that's just to anchor them into the soil. But here I'm growing some Asian greens in there. You could certainly grow lettuces in pots this size. My favourite though, because I have to admit I am a bit of a lazy waterer. Oops, I better go and water those pots. So I do like pots that are self-watering. And what this means is that below those little holes at just a third away up from the base, below that is a water reservoir. There's no soil in there, it's all water. And so the soil takes up that water by what's called a wicking system. It wicks it up. And so, you can go away for a weekend or so, have it full, and know that when you come back, your plants won't be dehydrated completely, particularly on a hot weekend. So that's, I like these self-watering pots. However, they are pricey. Now, that sells for about $80. Granted, I've had mine over 10 years, and it's been great. But if you wanted to make your own, you can. I'm going to show you just a brief outline. Again, this is on my website, step-by-step directions. So here we're using a polystyrene box, but it's called a broccoli box. So it doesn't have holes in it. You're going to have to make a hole for the water outlet. So at the base of it, we're putting, coarse sand or metal screenings. Metal screenings mean little stones, something that between those coarse particles, water can reside. We need to have something there because otherwise the soil would fall straight down into the water. But between the soil and the screenings, I've put some shade cloth. In my case, the one I've made recently, I had some old mosquito netting. So remember that thing about upcycling. You look at things, think, could I possibly use this in the garden? So I had kept that mosquito netting thinking, might be able to use this for something. And that's what I did. So on top of this coarse sand that I had, I put the mosquito netting and then my potting mix over the top. Now I also added this water inlet pipe, which isn't absolutely necessary, but then the water outlet is important because otherwise there's no drainage. So we want water to stay at the base, but we don't want water to be filling up the potting mix area as well. So you do need a water outlet. So what it might look like, this is the broccoli box that I used, and this is it all planted up. So you can see the inlet pipe. You could water straight over the top, but this means that the water will go straight to the base where I've got my sand, and so that fills it up nice and easily. On this, I've got it sitting on some old milk crates, by the way. Only because I've got it sitting up, it saves me bending down, of course, but also because that water outlet has to go onto something. So I've got a bucket down below. So around the side, sorry about the picture, you can't see, but there is a pipe poking out of this self-watering pot, and any excess water flows into that bucket, and I can use that bucketed water somewhere else in the garden in order to save a bit of water around the place. So look, full step-by-step instructions with photos are on my website if you'd like to have a go at making something like this. So go to your greengrocer and say, do you have any broccoli boxes? They'll know what you're talking about. You'll notice I painted it up. Remember, I don't like that white paint, just on the outside though. So what do you put in these pots? Now again, going to your local hardware or nursery, goodness me, the array of potting mixes is just enormous. You think, well, which one am I meant to choose? And I've been, for the purpose of this and another talk, I've had a good look at different potting mixes and what the differences are in them, because there's a big difference in price as well. So some of them, for example, will have this logo on the side, and it will tell you if it's a standard potting mix or if it's a premium potting mix. A premium mix will have extra nutrients in it, it'll have water-saving crystals in it, and it will just last a lot longer than your standard potting mix. So that's the difference in price. We do need to use potting mix in pots. Garden soil doesn't do well. What happens in garden soil is great in the garden because there's worms and other sort of creatures that go through and create holes in your soil, and that's good for plants' roots, because plants' roots need to breathe as well, so they need those air pockets in your soil. But as soon as you put garden soil in pots, those air pockets slump and your soil becomes compacted, so your plant's roots can't breathe and they get waterlogged, whatever. But that's why we can't use garden soil in pots. But as I mentioned before, if you don't buy the premium potting mix, get a cheaper one. You can add your compost to it, and then if you want to make it even better, some water-saving crystals. And I think I might have a picture of those, but what happens with those is that you put a teaspoon of these water crystals in a jar, fill it up with water, and they swell up to hold that water. You could also put in some slow-release fertilizer, and that fertilizer could be those little round balls called prills, like Maxi Crop or Osmocote, or you could use slow release. I like to use slow release organic fertilizer, such as Dynamic Lift, the smelly pellets. They don't act straight away, they are slow release. So you could do that just to make it go a little bit further. But if you wanted to make your own potting mix, there are a zillion recipes on the internet. But what you're looking for, your potting mix needs to be light and airy. Okay? We don't want it heavy so that it slumps. It needs to be long-lasting. That is, you don't want to have components in there that break down too quickly. And sometimes you'll find that in potting mixes, particularly for things that are in pots for long term, you find that the soil level decreases over time. And that's because your plants are taking up the nutrients, but also the components of that potting mix are breaking down. It needs to be able to hold moisture. That is, it'll have components in there that will swell to a larger size and hold the moisture so that it doesn't run straight through. And in Glen Ira, you probably notice in your garden, you've got sandy-based soils, and they are very difficult to retain moisture. That water goes straight through. So in your case as well, if you're growing in the garden soil, that's where compost really helps. But back to potting mix, some nutrient value is good as well. So potting mixes in general really only last about 6 months in terms of their nutrients, then they do need to be topped up. So in terms of making it light and airy and long lasting, we use this stuff called coir peat. It's different to peat moss that you might be familiar with, but coir peat comes from coconut fibre. So it is a sustainable sourced addition for your potting mix. So that's what makes it nice, light and airy, as well as long lasting. Another addition is vermiculite. Now, vermiculite is expanded volcanic glass or something like that, which has been dehydrated, whatever it is, pulverized a little bit. This is really good. Now, this is a mineral. It won't break down. So this will help your potting mix become a lot more long lasting as well. And a bag of it will go a long way. Here again, compost. So we sieve the compost, not through a tiny sieve, but things with larger holes, just to get rid of the large lumps that are in there. And that can go into your potting mix. Compost helps to make your potting mix more moisture retentive because organic matter can swell and hold up to 7 times its volume in water for you. So that's why compost is great in potting mix. Don't plant in straight compost because it's not light and airy, but it does have those other features. And if you've got a worm farm, those worm castings certainly do have that nutrient value. So coir peat is really quite inexpensive to buy. You buy it in a sort of the size of a brick and you put it in water and it swells up to perhaps the size of 2 or 3 buckets. Vermiculite, a bag of that, doesn't set you back too far. Compost, hopefully making your own, and worm castings as well. Now, plants. For me, soil is always more important than plants. Good soil helps good plants. But when you go to buy plants, you can have a look at buying, say, for example, a punnet of seedlings compared to a pack of seed. Once you learn how to grow from seed, you will save yourself hundreds, if not thousands of dollars over your lifetime. So for example, the price here of a punnet of seedlings, $3 to $5 easily for 6 to 8 plants. A pack of seed will literally have hundreds of plants, and I'm talking about lettuces, for example. If you're buying a pack of zucchini seed, it might have 30 seeds or something in it. But who needs 30 plants of zucchini? Still a lot cheaper. So it's important, though, to understand that we can't just go tossing seeds over the soil surface and hoping for the best. It does take a little bit of time. And so that's why we're paying so much for seedlings, because there's been, at least 6, if not up to 12 weeks for the growers to get it to that size compared to you in your garden. So if you were to sow some lettuce seed today, you wouldn't be expecting to eat it for quite a few weeks. There's the difference. In order to be organised, so looking ahead of time, I'd recommend going to this website called gardenate.com. That will tell you when to sow seeds as distinct to when to plant seedlings. So you just need to be a little bit organised. Or you could let nature do it for you. A lot of my plants in the garden come up because I let them self-seed, such as lettuces. I'll let it self-seed. Coriander, definitely. Rocket, always. Carrots, I haven't done it for a few years, but carrots will self-seed in their 2nd year of growing. And we all know that weeds self-seed. Nature knows how to do it. If the conditions are right, up come all of those seeds, including weeds. And here is, for example, lettuce growing in the cracks in some paving. Nature knows what to do. So save some time and effort by letting some of your garden become self-sown. Then there's taking cuttings. And here is where, if you go around your neighbourhood going for a walk, and there's a gardener in their front garden, and, gardeners love to talk about their gardens. They're always very generous with information, and they'll often be generous with cuttings as well. But knowing when to take the cuttings is important in order to get them to grow well. So we've got, at this time of the year, what we call softwood cuttings. It's a new growth that's come from spring. So that's softwood. Then there's some of that new growth starts to get harder over summer. So we call it semi-hardwood. And then taking cuttings over winter would be hardwood cuttings, and they come from dormant deciduous plants in winter. They take the longest. Your softwood cuttings would come up really quite quickly. So the semi-hardwood a little bit longer. Hardwood even 6 months before they start to show signs of life. So what we tend to do in his rosemary here, strip off most of the bottom leaves of a sprig of rosemary, pop them into a pot, several of them, and then here I'm using just an old bread bag, tie it off at the top. That's just to help stop the soil medium drying out. But once you start to see new signs of growth, you must take that off, otherwise everything will rot in there. But, go around to gardeners and, admire their plants and ask if you can take a cutting. Certainly don't go around and strip people's trees and leaves and shrubs, because that's a no-go there. But not just cuttings. You can divide up plants, and sometimes it's called root division. So grassy plants such as this society garlic, this was perhaps 2 pots where I divided it all up before I planted it. And this is making a little hedge, a low hedge around an apricot tree. So we're dividing it up, we're planting divisions. Then there's root sections. And this bottom picture here is of rhubarb. Now rhubarb, as the clumps can tend to become overgrown, what you do is get a sharp spade, go straight down the middle of a division there, and then as long as the root that you're pulling up has some shoots from it, you can plant that up and get new plants all over again from it. And succulents, even though these aren't edible, these are dead easy. Even just a leaf, if not the whole floret, a leaf or even part of the stem will create new plants. Succulents are nice and easy. And probably at this time of the year might be nice to start to do it to give away for Christmas presents as well. Other bits and pieces. If you're growing these in your garden, or if you've bought a bunch of spring onions or leeks, don't toss away the base, plant it. So leave a centimetre or so at the base and plant each of those in a pot or in the garden, and from the centre up will grow a new spring onion or a new leek, for example. And there are lots of different vegetables. I've heard of someone who cut off a beetroot top. So the top of the beetroot was there as well as all the leafy growth. They put that back in the soil and a new beetroot grew from below. I haven't tried it, but I think I will. But if you've got them already in your garden, don't pull out spring onions when you go to harvest them. Just cut them and more will come through. Carrots and parsnips, same deal. Now, other plants from cuttings. Now, these are plants from thinnings. So earlier this year, I grew lots of tomatoes from seed. And in some cases, I put 2 seeds in the same pot. And rather than try and divide them, what I did is I just cut the second seedling and then set them in water. Set those 4 little cuttings back in water, and within 2 weeks, I've got new plant growth. And then I've potted them up and they're ready to go in the garden as soon as the weather warms up just a little bit more. So this would be considered a softwood cutting here. So directly in some soil in potting mix, or I tried mine in water as well, and it worked. Now, other things you need in your garden. So get your plants in. Now let's look at mulch. And mulch can be quite expensive, particularly stuff that you put in veggie patches, because it's not your tan bark style mulch. It's a feeding mulch, straw-based ones. If you're growing this herbaceous perennial called comfrey, that chopped down and makes a fantastic mulch across your garden. At the moment, I'm growing broad beans, and as I'm harvesting, I'm chopping down the broad bean waste, chopping that up, and that's becoming mulch in my garden as well. You know about pea straw. This is same family. Ongoing, you might need to do some fertilising of your plants. So you can do some yourself, and it doesn't mean getting hubby out to the lemon tree and watering it that way. You can make your own weed liquid feeds, and one, for example, is weed tea. So if you've done some time doing some weeding, gather up those weeds, pop them into a large bucket, making sure the bucket has a lid, fill it up with water and leave them there to steep for a couple of weeks, stirring every now and again with, a big bamboo stake or something. Eventually it's going to really smell, but what happens is all that green goodness from those weeds is leached back into that water, and you've got nutrients from there. I mean, weeds are just plants that are growing where we don't want them to grow. They still do have nutrient value. So that's weed tea, and it looks pretty disgusting. It smells even worse, but it's for free, and that's what we're all about today. So keep a lookout for large buckets or plastic drums that have lids, and a good place to get them is, say, a bakery. They often get not buckets this size, but at least 20-litre buckets, because they get their icing and fondant and stuff in those buckets. Go and ask them. They've probably got some to give away. Here's the compost again. Remember I mentioned you could put compost in a mesh bag of some sort. If you don't have a mesh bag, an old pillowcase will work. And then steep it into this bucket of water. And you've got this lovely resulting dark liquid, which is the nutrients that are coming out of that compost. You could do this with worms as well. The comfrey, I mentioned before, that plant, steep some leaves into a bucket like that. And even if you don't have any of these, if you live near Caulfield Racecourse, you can get down there. Things are so uncertain, aren't they, nowadays, what we're allowed to do and not allowed to do. But, there's always horse manure that you could steep in a bucket like that too. Or the resulting liquid could be used as a fertiliser. If you want to buy seaweed, liquid seaweed, you can buy it in bottles, which is a lot of water, or you can buy in a soluble powder. Now, just a note about seaweed, it's not a plant food, okay? Notice it's saying complete garden health treatment. It's not a straight food. It is, it's a tonic. Just like we might take a vitamin pill if we're deficient in certain minerals, this is like a vitamin pill for your soils. It does contain potash, which is good for flowering, but not necessarily the food element that plants need. Worm farms. I keep mentioning worms, and they're great for both the vermicast, which is their worm poo, as well as the liquid. The liquid from worm farms, diluted to the colour of a cup of tea, makes a good organic liquid fertiliser. You can make your own. You don't have to pay up to $100 for a worm farm. Again, broccoli boxes, and on my website there are instructions on how to make your own worm farm. If you've got children or grandchildren or something, I reckon having a worm farm around is fantastic. Kids don't get their hands dirty anymore, and it's a real bane for me. I hate it. I want to see kids getting their hands dirty, and they get a thrill when they see wriggling worms in real life and not just on a computer screen. So do that for the environment, for your garden, as well as your grandchildren. If you couldn't be bothered going to all that trouble, you can bury a plastic pot that you've drilled holes into it, into the ground, add a handful of worms, and I've added them from my existing worm farm. So this is sitting in my veggie patch, and so it's got worms in it, but those worms can go in and out as they wish through those holes, but they come back because I keep feeding. They, for example, love watermelon rind. I've got to have a lid over it, and that's just an upturned plant pot base. Otherwise, magpies come in and will eat the worms away from you. And that sort of helps the worms move the nutrients in and out of the soil around your plants. I'm actually going to set up one of these away from my veggie garden though, for dog poo. So I'm going to put some worms from my worm farm in there and add dog poo. So after the dog comes back from a walk, I'm going to empty the bag into that, so the worms can eat the dog poo, and that becomes less of a litter problem. Other things you might need: potash, remember, helps your plants grow flowers. So if you've got flowering annuals, or if you've got plants that need flowers in order to grow fruit, banana peels. Chop them up, steep them in a bucket of water, or bury them underneath you where you're going to plant your tomatoes. They'll add potash. Eggshells, great source of calcium. Bake them, and that makes them easier to crush up afterwards. Sprinkle it throughout your soil. Great for calcium there. Now, weed control. Pains, aren't they? And weeds at this time of the year, particularly with this moist weather we're having. But if you've got weeds in cracks in brickwork and so on, or in the concrete like this one. Go and have a cup of tea. Whatever's left in the kettle, go out there and pour it over those weeds. Okay, that won't get rid of the taproot straight away, but if you're consistent with it, eventually it will, because those plants can't photosynthesize, they can't get any more energy because you're at them all the time, and eventually they will die off. Now, pest control. I like to try and keep the pests away from my plants, so I will net whole beds depending on what I'm trying to keep the pests away. So those pesky little cabbage moth butterflies, to stop them getting to the plants, I'll net the whole bed until it's cold in winter time and those butterflies aren't around. So if you don't want to buy the netting, and by the way, that type of netting I've got there, I'm not allowed to use as of September the 1st next year, because birds and things get caught in it. You need a much finer netting. But you can go to op shops and look for old curtain netting. Get it for next to nothing, and that works just as well for several years. It might not be UV stabilised, so after a while it might not work, but certainly the time being. Those eggshells I mentioned before, put them around those vulnerable plants for snails and slugs. Or even better, at this time of the year, keep old bottles, cut them down and make a little cover or a cloche for those seedlings that snails and slugs will devour overnight. They won't get in this way. During the day, take them off. At night, put them back in, put them back over. And as soon as those plants are big enough to outgrow those bottles, then they don't need it anymore. They can withstand a little bit of attack. Other things you might need in your garden for tying up things. Don't throw away old pantyhose. Fantastic as soft, stretchable material for tying up plants. The shade cloth or bird netting. Here's the curtain netting I mentioned before. And I'm going to finish off just by looking at, I mentioned before that the milk cartons, those 2-litre milk bottles, what can you possibly reuse this for once it's empty? Well, let me show you a few things. Of course, you can cut them down and make plant tags out of that with a permanent marker. Very cheap to do. You can make a soil scoop. So you might be able to scoop up your potting mix by cutting off the top and using the handle there. You could also have it as a funnel. Remember I showed you before how to use toilet rolls. It's very hard to actually fill the toilet rolls with potting mix, but I found that the mouth or the neck of this bottle fits perfectly into a toilet roll. So that sits on top of the toilet roll, and then I will fill up that scoop with some potting mix and just shake it through. And that's how I fill up toilet rolls with potting mix. So you can use it like a funnel. I can pierce some holes in the top using a sharp nail or something, or a heated metal skewer, and that becomes a watering system for seedlings. So you're not putting gushes of water, but just like a fine rose, watering can rose for them. So it becomes a watering implement. And another thing where to cover your plants overnight. So it might be the cut down bottom of the watering of the milk carton, and that sits over your plants overnight. And you can sort of press it down in your soil so like pesky little earwigs can't get in and under. And if nothing else, the base of it becomes I've got one of these sitting on my potting bench, just with all those bits and pieces that never have anywhere to put them. They just become like a pencil holder for them. So that's what I talk about upcycling. You sort of ask yourself, can I reuse things in a different way in my garden? So my 3S principle, remember, scrounge for other things that could possibly be used. Save a lot of money by saving bits and pieces that can be used in the garden. And that also means saving seeds from year to year. Because of time constraints, I haven't gone into how to save seed. But again, I'd invite you to go onto my website. There's lots of information there. And of course, be as gardeners are, very, very generous. Share, and people will share with you as well. And so before, of course, you throw anything out, ask yourself, can I use this in the garden? And there is my website. Now, I'm noticing there are some questions coming through. It is 1:45, so I'd be finishing up soon, but let's have a look at the questions. There's a question from Charles. To replenish herbs and vegetable beds, should we add topsoil or compost, and how thick? Okay, well, if you want to save money, you'd be adding compost, Charles. So this is what I do twice a year in my garden beds. So before the warm season plantings, so I've already done it for this year because I'm starting to already put my warm season plants in, such as tomatoes and so on. You do need to replenish the soil. It doesn't mean going out and buying topsoil. I want to add organic matter. And here is where I empty out the compost bins and I spread it around the garden. Now you're asking how thick? Well, it depends on how much you've got, really. So if you've only got a little, just put a little in. If you've only got small amounts, what I like to do is just go with a hand trowel, make a hole in the soil, put some compost in there, and then just cover it up with that soil all over again. So sort of spot, what would you call it? I don't know. Just put some in different spots around the garden. If you've got enough for a whole layer, put it on. 2 to 3 centimetres thick is fantastic. Any thicker is even better. Now, when you're putting it onto your soil, we don't go out there with a spade and dig. Okay, we are looking at just tickling it into the top layer of the soil. Trust me, worms will come and drag it down for you. The reason we don't like to dig, number one, it's not good for your back, but secondly, digging exposes those soil microbes that I was talking about. They don't like sitting on the soil surface. They are below the soil surface for a reason. And that's because exposed to sunlight, they'd probably die off. So by you going and digging and turning over, what happens is that you're exposing those microbes and killing them off. Now, I know that digging is part of our mental psyche. It's part of our DNA as gardeners. We've seen our dads do it, our granddads and so on. Everyone digs and turns over and so on. Unless you're setting up a garden from scratch, I never do any digging. I really don't. Unless I'm digging a hole to plant a tree or something. I don't dig. I tickle instead. So I go to that top of the soil and just with the hand trowel, just lightly move things through, but not digging. So I do that in anticipation of my warm season plants, and then once the tomatoes and everything are out, I do it again. I replenish that soil with the compost, or if you can't get compost, some well-rotted cow manure. Horse manure is a little bit dicey. I prefer to put horse manure in my compost before using it directly in the garden, simply because of the issue with a lot of the weed seeds that will come up again. But I'll do it again in, say, March, in anticipation of growing things from April onwards. So twice a year, for great soil health, it's really important to do a little bit of that rejuvenating of your soil. Now, have we got any more questions? Oh, hopefully I've answered everything that you might have had. I would invite you, though, remember, go back to my website, mygreengarden.com.au. I'm not selling anything, got nothing. I've just got a lot of information from decades now of growing food, growing ornamentals as well, and as well as working in a nursery for close on 20 years. Fingers crossed we can get back into nurseries all over again, but just remind yourself, you can probably do away with a lot of those things that nurseries sell by creating the plants yourself, growing them from seed, making the fertilizer yourself, and definitely, if you possibly can, making compost somehow. So thank you all very much for listening, and go out and have a great afternoon in the garden. Thank you, Glen Ira, for sponsoring this series of webinars, and it's a fantastic initiative. Thank you. Goodbye.